Everyone. Before I start, this is just a conventional standard message. We warning that we will be recording this seminar. So for privacy issue, if you have an issue with the fact of recording, you can still attend the seminar through the Facebook page, the YouTube page, sorry. So we are very honored today to have Professor Trevor Barnes here at the Grand Sasso Science Institute. Professor Barnes is widely known in human geography and particularly for his studies, his pioneering studies on economic geography and the role of metaphors and discourse in the production of economic facts and economic representations. Today he will speak about a legendary figure in human geography, William Bunge, who is a really prominent and quite peculiar figure because of he's known for his foundational treatise on from 1960 that was titled Theoretical Geography, a book that was based on his PhD dissertation that initially was titled The Fundamental Geography, if I remember well. And then Bill Bunge underwent a kind of a radical change in his trajectory. He moved to Detroit and he became a radical. And in the early 70s, he published an ethnographic monograph on the neighborhood in which he was living in Detroit, a black neighborhood. And this monograph, interestingly, was very ethnographic and very qualitative and going against, in a way, any standard of social scientific studies. I think there was no bibliography and there was very provision of very few statistical data, and so it was accepted, was received quite cautiously, even if I would say skeptically, by the scholarly community. And then this book, Fitzgerald, was rediscovered about 30, 40 years later. University of Georgia Press republished it, and Trevor Barnes with other people published a very engaging forum on progressive human geography on this book, which was presented in the progressive human geography series Classics in Human Geography Revisited. And Bill Bunge has also exerted influence on different geography communities, including in Europe. He inspired also a kind of critical geography strand in Italy in the 70s, so-called Geografia Democratica at that time. And the rediscovery of fieldwork, or as it's called in Italian, as it was called at that time, ricerca sul terreno. But it also made influence on French-speaking geography, and also beyond geography itself. The monthly magazine Le Monde Diplomatique, the kind of famed, high-reputed magazine, published in 2009 a very interesting article on the legacy of Bill Bunge geographical expeditions in Detroit. So today we are really happy and eager to know from Trevor Barnes about this this key intellectual figure in the early stages of radical urban geography. So I will leave the floor to Trevor, and I'm really grateful to him for being here, and I hope you will enjoy this talk. Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you so much, Ugo. It's really both a pleasure and an honor to be here, to be invited to your institute. I really appreciate you asking me. So I might be wrong in this, but I suspect my talk will not be like many of the presentations that you've held in this seminar series. It's philosophical and historical rather than methodological and economic. It's fundamentally about geography, though. It's about maps. So the American geographer Carl Sauer once said, show me a geographer who does not need maps constantly and want them about them, and I shall have my doubts as to whether they have made the right choice of life. Well, I'm sure I made the right choice in life. I became a geographer partly because of my need to show and talk about maps, as you'll see today. So in my presentation, I want to bring together my obsession with maps with two other obsessions, American pragmatist philosophy and the maverick American geographer, William Bunge, or Wild Bill Bunge, as he was dubbed. Both these obsessions date back to graduate school at the University of Minnesota, now more than 40 years ago. So because of my parochial education in Britain, I had never heard of American pragmatism before I was introduced to it in my first year by the wonderful Minnesota geography professor, Fred Lukeman, fittingly the most American man that I'd ever met. His point, and it's going to be my point today, is that pragmatism is a philosophy of practical accomplishment, a philosophy for changing the world. If a philosophy can't make the world better, Fred Lukeman would say, it's not a philosophy I want to know. I had not heard either of Bill Bunge before I arrived at Minnesota. But for an urban geography class that I took at Minnesota during my first year, we were required to read a section from his 1971 book, Fitzgerald. And I still have a very clear memory of checking the book out from the library course book reserve desk. And you had to read it within 2 hours or get fined. But once I started reading his book, I just couldn't stop not reading it. It said that some writers cannot not write. And in that late afternoon, the University of Minnesota, I could not read. I remember sheepishly handing over $5 to the librarian that evening, my fine for what was now an overdue book. And $5 was a lot of money for me back then. My total budget for the week was $25. But I remember thinking afterwards, I'd got enormous value for money. So I'm going to divide my talk into two. First of all, I'm going to say something about American pragmatism, its origins, but much more so its larger project that I'm going to call conversational philosophy. And that last term comes from perhaps pragmatism's most well-known proponent, at least recent proponent, the American philosopher Richard Rorty, who died in 2007. So for Rorty, the point of philosophy is not to describe what the world is really like, but rather to enlarge our cultural vocabulary, our cultural repertoire, by experimenting with new lexicons and points of view. In turn, he thinks that will then allow us to think of both ourselves and the world in which we live in new ways, making possible acts we have never undertaken before, never conceived before. Then in the second part of the talk, I turn to Bill Bunge and argue that his work on maps was a case of Rortian conversational philosophy. Now, much of his work was done outside of the formal academy, but he was engaged through conversation in novel experiments. In his case, mobilizing and trying out new spatial vocabularies that were embodied within new kinds of a map. And again, following Rorty, those maps were important, not because they were somehow better depictions of the world as the map is a kind of a mirror of nature, but because they allowed people to do things that they otherwise could not have done. Now, I should say that this was not how Bill Bunge thought about what he was doing, but I'm going to suggest that, like Molière's Monsieur Jourdain, who spoke prose without knowing it, Bill Bunge spoke American pragmatism without knowing it. So let me begin by saying something very briefly about the origins of American pragmatism. And it's most associated with these men you see on the screen, as trio of figures, all born in the mid to late 19th century: Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. And that movement emerged as a reaction to the traumatic experience of the American Civil War. The war had shot a hole through American society, cutting the nation to the quick, and the framework of ideas by which Americans had previously made sense of themselves had clearly disastrously failed, producing this horrific conflagration. And pragmatism was one of the responses. It was conceived as a means for national ameliorative change. So as John Dewey famously said, philosophy recovers itself when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with problems of men. And that's exactly what pragmatism tried to do, to be a method for dealing with the problems of people. And to do so, it tried to fashion a new grid of ideas in which the cruelty of the American Civil War could never be conceived again, and then hence could never reoccur. So within that grid of new ideas, let me mention just two. The first was in a way negative, ridding the world of what I'm going to call foundationalism, which is the belief that ideas are timeless, anchored in an eternal truth. And that has been the tradition of Western philosophy really ever since Plato. The pragmatist philosopher Richard Bernstein has called foundationalism the Platonic urge, the desire to escape from the here and now and attempt something atemporal. For the pragmatist, though, it's precisely this kind of Platonic thinking, this fixed belief in eternal verities that produced such terrors as the Civil War. So for pragmatists, Plato's cave is empty. The here and now is all that we have. So ideas don't already exist in some perfect form, but emerge contingently in response to the particular needs and practices of people as they live out their lives in a given place and time. So ideas for the pragmatists are like knives and forks, implements to accomplish particular tasks. They are not transcendental truths. And if an idea no longer delivers the goods, or worse, delivers the cruelty of war, those ideas must be dropped and new ones adopted. And this is what makes pragmatism pragmatism. It's a philosophy of practical achievement. Ideas are labeled true when they enable us to do things, when they cope with the world. So as William James wrote, truth happens to an idea. It becomes true. It is made true by events. And the second of these ideas within this grid that pragmatists introduced is pluralism. It's a word that William James invented in 1909. And it's the idea that the world does not hang together all of a piece, but is fractured by irredeemable difference and otherness. So there's no single principle that holds everything together. So as James wrote, the world is, quote, a turbid, muddled, Gothic sort of affair without a sweeping outline and little pictorial nobility. So our task then becomes to talk across the difference and the fractures, the otherness, rather than trying to somehow bulldoze that difference, imposing some single flattening principle. So if we don't do this, the pragmatists warn, we get the American Civil War, or in many ways, the insurrection that we just witnessed at the US Capitol building a month or so ago. So let me just now say something about Rorty, sorry. And his notion of this conversational philosophy. And it begins with this book that you see, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, published in 1979. Up until this point, Rorty was what was called an analytical philosopher, concerned precisely with satisfying the Platonic urge. But that was all reversed in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, where he declared, in effect, Plato's project as bankrupt, and the search for some kind of universal truth hopeless. Instead, he drew on American pragmatism, especially John Dewey's work, to delineate a philosophy without foundations, so anti-foundationalism, based on conversation and experiment. So Rorty, Mark II, argued that there were no foundations, such as neutral facts or rationality or Platonic essences, that could ever provide an unassailable backstop for knowledge, for providing ironclad warrant for truth claims. Instead, following the pragmatists, Rorty averred that knowledge arose only from contingent social practices, from trying out vocabularies that allowed humans to cope with the world, to navigate their way around them. So, as again William James had earlier put it, knowledge and ideas were to be judged only by their fruits and not by their roots. So for Rorty and other pragmatists, there was no special method for producing knowledge, for achieving practical ends, no foolproof rules to follow. And that kind of thinking is really found within only Platonism and its various modern derivations. So under pragmatism, the best we can do, the only thing we can do is, to quote Rorty, to cast about for a vocabulary that will help. That is to experiment by using novel and creative forms of language, including narrative, metaphor, irony, as well as other kinds of tropes to re-describe the world. So by inventing new words, telling new stories, putting those words and stories into action, into motion, it's sometimes possible to break through old standoffs and log jams where previous conversation had lagged or stalled or had been abandoned. So the new words and stories become potential sparks for reigniting the conversation, permitting us to do things that we had never accomplished before. So key to this process is a word that I have already used, which is experimentation, a willingness to take risk. Not that all or even most of experiments actually succeed. Thomas Edison, the man you see here, said about his unsuccessful experiments in trying to make a working light bulb, quote, "I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Failure is built into experimentation, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. After 10,000 failures, Edison finally succeeded. And in doing so, he transformed the world, creating a new reality. Radiant nighttime city streets, brightly lit homes after dark, and illuminated factory spaces, enabling round-the-clock production. So it's this kind of transformation that pragmatists also believe is possible by inventing new vocabularies, and which I think at least is Bunge's belief too. So experimentation is vital, but because of its low frequency of success, the more experimentation, the better. And this was the view of one of the people associated with those early pragmatists in the US. This is the US Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "All life is an experiment." Our success, therefore, depends on as many different people as possible providing experiments, even those whose opinions we loathe. And Rorty makes the same point, contending that experimentation must be open to everyone, even to people who we think of as cranks or who are marginal or with whom we disagree. So it's the diversity that produces a better conversation, livelier forms of what Richard Rorty calls kibitzing. That is engagement, dialogue, exchange, and talk. You can see some kibitzing going on in the illustration. So in turn, Rorty believes that kind of exchange, kibitzing, can produce what he calls edification, defined as the project of finding new, better, more interesting, more fruitful ways of speaking. So that quest never ends. And to suppose that it might end is again to fall into the trap of Platonism with its terminating truth of eternal essences. For pragmatists, in contrast, the point is always to continue the conversation. A conversation, as Rorty puts it, which presupposes no disciplinary matrix which unites the speakers, but where the hope of agreement is never lost so long as the conversation lasts. So what I'd like to do in the remainder of this talk is to take Rorty's pragmatist model, philosophy as conversation, with its associated emphasis on experimentation, and then try to use it to understand the work of this nonconformist, dissenting American geographer, Bill Bunge. So at various times during his life, Bunge was deemed by his mainstream detractors, sometimes by even his associates, even by his friends, not that he had many friends, or at least many friends that lasted, as a crank, as a contrarian, a troublemaker, a menace, as cantankerous, as someone to avoid. And it's clear that he was troubled and that he had a troubled life. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the myriad stories that continue to swirl around him, including even that he was brainwashed as part of the infamous MK Ultra scheme run by the CIA's Sidney Gottlieb during the Cold War. So MK Ultra was charged with securing the mind control of foreign leaders as well as domestic dissidents by covertly administering to them psycho-hallucinatory drugs, especially LSD. You can see the image here. This is of a reenactment of Gottlieb pouring LSD into someone's drink. So if Bunge was a victim of MK Ultra, it left no mark on his intellect, which remained throughout his life acute and febrile. And this was the case right from the get-go, when he was a graduate student at the University of Washington, Seattle. And there he was taught for a quarter by the great Swedish geographer, Torsten Hagerstrand, who said about him, quote, that he has a stroke of genius, a type of person not common in our profession. And one aspect of that genius was carrying out novel experiments, mobilizing new spatial vocabularies to realize geographical edification. So those innovative spatial vocabularies often took the form of maps. So maps for Bunge were geography's language, geography's talk, geography's conversation. So as Bunge wrote in his doctoral thesis, quote, the reason geography has always paid such respect to maps is that they have been the logical framework upon which geographers have constructed a geographical theory. For Bunge, however, the form taken by maps was not inviolable, it's not fixed in character, nor rooted in any kind of essential cartographic truth. Rather, the vocabulary of maps was sufficiently flexible that in pragmatist fashion, it could be creatively bent and reshaped to cope to cope with specific needs in the world. So cartography then offered fruits, not roots. Novel map talk could, Bunge believed, be transformational. So by carrying out original cartographic redescription, Bunge aimed in his work to break through the existing crust of cartographic convention to create something brand new, to change the world for the better, to revolutionize it. And so I'm going to illustrate this argument by working through 3 different maps, each from a different phase of Bunge's career. The first was from his earliest work in his PhD thesis around map transforms, as they're called. The second was around his work in Detroit, in Black inner city of Detroit, working with the community of Fitzgerald. And the final is his and last substantive cartography was a nuclear war atlas that warned against the ultimate catastrophe, nuclear Armageddon. So Bunge's first exposure to formal geographical talk was in 1951. So it was conscripted for the Korean War and deployed at the chemical, biological, and radiological wartime school in Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. It was there that he enrolled in his first class in geography. And it's given by the man you see on the right. This is Richard Hartshorne, who, at least according to himself, had written the definitive book on geography, the nature of geography. And Hartshorne was based at the main campus of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, but he was a professor at various, gave various extension classes around the state, and that was how Bill Bunge met up with him. The relationship began well, but it increasingly soured as Hartshorne indulged his habit of meticulous correction. So Hartshorne's definition of geography was of regionalism. So the purpose of geography for him was this scrupulous empirical description of unique regions. And maps within this view were simply mirror representations of the regions they represented. Now, while Bunge frequently disagreed with Hartshorne, these extension classes really sparked in Bunge's life this obsession with geography. Bunge later said that obsession produced a tortuous life, but ultimately deeply satisfying. As he put it in 1968, quote, "I must say I've not found it easy. It's an agony, but a marvelous agony. Geography is wonderful." And that agony was in fact quite quick in coming. After doing a master's degree with Hartshorne, Bunge went on to do a PhD with him. But that's where the trouble began. Bunge failed his doctoral comprehensive exams in part because of a deciding negative vote by Hartshorne, and consequently he was asked to leave the program. In 1958, he didn't give up on geography. He went to the University of Washington to pursue his PhD. And in fact, it was a much better place for him because there were a group of graduate students and faculty at Washington, collectively known as the Space Cadets, who already were questioning Hartshorne's descriptive regionalism, offering instead a rigorous explanatory approach based on the methods and philosophy of natural science, aspiring to scientific generalization and ultimately the discovery of geographical laws. So from a Rortyian perspective, this Washington group represented an attempt to alter the conversation in human geography around Hartshornian regionalism had in effect reached a gridlock, had come to a halt. New vocabularies, an attempt at a revolution and redescription was necessary to propel geography forward. And that's what was happening at Seattle among those space cadets. So the region remained the focus, but it was redescribed, put into a new conversation with the methods and the vocabulary of natural science. And so this was what was going on in Washington. This was what excited Bunge. And so Bunge's thesis was completed in 1960. It represented in many ways the furthermost fulfillment of this new form of geography as science. He was going to call the dissertation fundamental geography. It might have been a better idea than the one that he actually chose, which was theoretical geography. Fundamental geography, I think, points to the root and branch character of the change that Bunge envisaged and wanted to put into practice within geography. So in Bunge's case, he brought together in conversation as an experiment the region and mathematics, and particularly geometry and its vocabulary of space. And there really had been nothing like it ever before in the history of geography. So key to his project was cartography. He was adding to the geographical conversation primarily a new cartographic vocabulary, a redescription of maps. And of course, maps have long been an article of faith within geography. And for regional geographers, maps were simply the mirror representation of the world. Bunge called those regionalists who had this view of cartography map thumpers, maps as mimetic copies, mirror copies of the world. So in his thesis, Bunge argued that the geometrical principles, the mathematical functionals, as he called them, underlying maps needed to be made explicit. And the principles underlying the map thumper view, he thought were of Euclidean geometry that produced an absolute Newtonian conception of space. So to move the conversation forward, Bunge instead pushed for a new cartography that would realize a more than Euclidean, non-absolute space representation. Bunge never worked through the formal derivations of that project, but nonetheless he pointed to a technique which facilitated that, which was that of map transformations. So map transformations is a complicated topic, but the gist is that by transforming the measurement of distance or area on a map from the conventional metric of kilometers or miles to another metric like time or cost, or famously in the case of one of Bunge's maps, dead bodies, cartographic space is radically altered. So the geometry of the map frequently becomes non-Euclidean. It's no longer absolute space, but relational space. And that's seen in this figure on your screen, both taken from Bunge's dissertation on travel times within Seattle's downtown to outlying city points. So the figure on the left, the figure 1A, is of the untransformed map of Seattle, which retains its conventional Euclidean form with distance measured in miles. The other map, 1B, is after the transformation. So distance is only represented as travel times, producing a non-Euclidean map with the cartographic spaces of Seattle consequently stretched or shrunk. So these spaces are now drawn relationally, illustrating the non-linearities, the foldings, and the social production of space. So the broader point in all of this, following Rorty's pragmatism, is Bunge's use of transforms as, in effect, an experimental vocabulary to re-describe spatial relations. So in doing so, geography moves beyond that stale conversational regionalism. Now, of course, Bunge doesn't do this alone. It involves kibitzing with, in particular, those other space cadets. They had a special room in Smith Hall in geography, known as the Citadel. They talked at the so-called Tuesday lunch seances with one of the young professors in the department, Bill Garrison. Or again, it happened through a departmental discussion paper series that they initiated. There's one more point I want to make about this phase of Bunge's life, and it's a general one about all experiments, which is that you never know quite where they're going to lead. In the case of Bunge's cartographical experiments, he had no idea of the consequences once maps were linked to computers. So he reflected in 1966 about what the computer had done to geography, and he was clearly rattled. He said, quote, "To see region construction, one of the last preserves of the non or anti-mathematical geographers, crumble away before the ever-growing appetite of the computing machine is a little unnerving, even for a hard case quantifier." And his work that he'd done on map transforms at Seattle, along with other students there, was in effect made for computerization. And according to one commentator, Timothy Barney, that helped revolutionize post-war cartography, preparing it for the automation and digitization that would power military surveillance and mapping applications. So in many ways, Bunge didn't know what he had let out of the bag. And you can see one of those military maps was one done in the late 1960s or 1970, I think, of Vietnam, that was based, in fact, on some of these map transforms that Bunge had been recommending back in 1960. So from the mid-1960s, however, Bunge began experimenting with a different kind of cartographic redescription. And it derived from his work in the 1 square mile, predominantly black in the city neighborhood of Fitzgerald in Detroit, where he also resided and about which he later wrote his book, Fitzgerald. So in 1962, he had taken a job at Wayne State University in Detroit, and he was continuing to peddle his mathematical cartography. So his living in Fitzgerald, in combination with a series of turbulent political and social events that just kept on piling up in 1960s America, around war, around poverty, racism, civil rights, urban riots, and political assassinations, made him rethink his project, his original project. The trigger, Bunge once said, was looking out of his Wayne State office window at the mainly African-American inner city of Detroit and realizing that his cartographic geometries were never fully going to explain the world that he saw, or the processes propelling it, or that changed it. So that was a kind of appalling experience, a need for rethinking, and which he did through mobilizing a new vocabulary, new forms of geographical redescription, to put it in the pragmatist vocabulary. And so he found this new vocabulary by going onto the street, going into his own increasingly Black neighborhood of Fitzgerald, becoming involved and engaged in undertaking new forms of cartography, raising questions about both the kinds of people who could draw maps and the kinds of things that maps could represent. And his new style of mapping began almost immediately after Bunge took up his post at Wayne State in the autumn of 1962. So in his first class, he took the students out to do field mapping in Detroit's inner city. And by 1964, the students were surveying the poorest inner city districts on Detroit's east side. And in 1968, along with an 18-year-old Black woman, you see here as is Gwendolyn Warren, who already was a community activist in Fitzgerald, Bunge founded the Detroit Geographical Expedition and Institute, the DGEI, that would carry out in collaboration with Fitzgerald community members research and the mapping of the neighborhood. So for Warren and Bunge, the point of DGEI was that Fitzgerald's residents become contributors to knowledge rather than sources of knowledge to be appropriated. And that research took different forms, but as Bunge wrote, it would always involve being there, talking, listening, arguing, befriending, and even making enemies. And in part, this was done in Bunge's own house, and that goes to the image that you see. So the result of all this was community flyers, advocacy reports, position papers, submissions to city council, and maps, especially maps, but not maps as somehow kind of a God's eye view of the world, austere and supposedly mirror copies, but instead representations of the lived daily experiences of a community made legible through mapping. And so those maps would be, as Phil Cohen labeled them, quote, life maps, maps that tell stories in a way that brings data to human life. And the maps that were produced were found partly in his book Fitzgerald, as well as 4 sets of field notes that functioned as annual reports excuse me, for the DGEI. And in Rorty's terms, those maps were in effect radical geographical redescriptions. Those maps expanded the cultural repertoire available to Fitzgerald's residents, providing potential means to make possible achievements not realized before, including neighborhood change. And that cartography based on lived experience and a charged political impulse both subtended as well as expanded the possibility of map making. They were oughtness maps, as Bergman and Morrill called them, bearing a visual critique of existing social relations, starkly revealing the many structural forms of injustice and inequity that bore on Fitzgerald's community members as they lived out their lives, while at the same time pointing to potential changes that could make their lives better. And a striking example is the map that you see. It's called Where Commuters Run Over Black Children on the Point's Downtown track, that appeared in one of the field notes. At its most basic, the map tells the story of the everyday experience of Black children in Fitzgerald as they tried to cross the road during rush hours, as white drivers commute from their eastern suburban homes, this is the Points, to downtown. At one corner alone, 6 Black children are run over and killed. So the extreme subject makes a powerful oughtness map, both exposing the social relations that produce such a tragic outcome, while at the same time demonstrating what must be changed to prevent what is portrayed. So D. Morris and Stephen Boyce call the map a radical cartography of murder sites, laying bare social facts that lay behind it, such as pedestrian paths, commuter traffic, and race relations. Dennis Wood, a cartographer, is even blunter. He says it's a map of racial infanticide, a racial child murder map. So Bunge's cartographical experiment here is not as technical as were his maps in theoretical geography, but it's just as novel, a transformational and revolutionary map, maybe more so. So by intervening into the cartographic conversation, by changing who is allowed to make maps and about what kinds of things can be mapped, Bunge makes us think about the world anew and considers and pushes us to consider ways to change it. So he wants his map to provoke, to edify geographically, to produce a world in which no Black children are ever run over in Detroit by white commuters. And my third third case of Bunge using cartography as novel geographical redescription was in some ways the most difficult, certainly the most haunting and chilling. It was redescribing the geography of nothing, the world after the nuclear bomb. And that's the aim of this book, The Nuclear War Atlas. So the nuclear bomb was a menacing presence from early on in Bunge's adult life. He was 17 when Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, and age 22 when he was at Camp McCoy teaching, as he put it, nuclear war. From then, he experienced the continued existential threat of Cold War nuclear annihilation that included the 1962 Cuban crisis, various numerous close calls, and from 1983, President Reagan's Star Wars that had US nuclear missiles orbiting and ready to destroy any weapon launched by the Soviet Union. Bunge believed nuclear war was not survivable. It would not only be the end of human civilization as we knew it, but it would be the end of humans. And he tried to geographically demonstrate that in his book. So Bunge conceived and produced the Atlas in Canada. In 1968, he was fired from Wayne State, ostensibly for swearing in class. But he remained in Detroit, writing Fitzgerald and directing research carried out by the DGEI. In 1972, he moved permanently to Canada. In his mind, at least, he was a political refugee. And he eventually settled in Quebec, founding the Society of Human Exploration. And in 1984, that society published the document that you see on the screen. It was a pamphlet of 28 maps called Nuclear War Atlas, which in 1988 was then expanded into a full-length book with the same title, with 57 maps. The book is certainly not for the faint of heart. Fraser MacDonald writes, quote, Bunge's Atlas maps out a post-apocalyptic terrain without any attempt to soften the theme of unremitting and numbing disaster. Few geographers have offered such a bleak cartography. But that bleakness had a purpose, the same purpose as the maps as in Fitzgerald. All those maps, as Bergman and Morrill write, are, quote, motivated by an urgency to have geography analyze and respond to human crises of the times, responses that relied on analysis with creative spatial methods. And that creativity is found in this map, which is called the closest neighbor ever, the Soviet Union and the United States. So the map is an attempt to intervene experimentally within the conversation about nuclear war by drawing on a novel geographical vocabulary. But as you can see from the map, it's not a conventional map of the world. It's in fact missing two major land blocks. The Soviet Union is not there, and the United States is not there, apparently. But in fact, they are there. And that's seen in the legend of the map, which is in the bottom left-hand side of the map. In the USSR, represented by hash marks going one way, and the USA by hash marks going the other way. And as you can see from how the world is covered by those crossed hash marks, that both the United States and America, United States and the Soviet Union are both there. They are in fact everywhere. They cover the entire map. And the point of Bunge's experiments in map making is to show how nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles have produced a world of what he calls radical proximity of closest neighbors, where the entire surface of the globe everywhere shares the same nuclear apocalyptic space. So there's no hiding, no escaping outside, no outside. Political space and boundaries have been radically configured. So as Bergman and Morrow moral right. The map is a cartographic and geometric vision of a topological space collapse of the political spatiality that had preceded the advent of the intercontinental ballistic missile, after which superpowers could suddenly reach all points on the planet with a maximal force nearly instantaneously, eliminating the interior, transforming the topological nature of superpower borders, and reordering the very connectivity of space. The new border was not south or north, but up. So Bunge's contribution to the conversation about nuclear war is to say that to be fully understood, it needs to be represented through maps, but not as conventional cartography based on Euclidean principles, which only freezes space, naturalizes points and lines. A nuclear war under a regime of intercontinental ballistic missiles is dynamic, changing the very topology of space. Far becomes near, fixed points are no longer fixed, planes furl, fold, curl, and collide. So Bunge's cartographic redescription, this new spatial vocabulary embodied in this map, enlarges the existing repertoire for talking about the consequences of nuclear war. But it's so horrific that he hopes it will prevent those very consequences. So let me summarize. So following Rorty's pragmatism, I've suggested we should conceive of thinking as experiments in an ongoing conversation about how to cope with the world. And I've tried to illustrate this thesis by using the work and career of the maverick American geographer, William Bunge, and the maps he drew. So in the three maps of his that I've discussed, I made the argument that he drew on experimental spatial vocabularies to in effect break an impasse in the conversation, and in the process sought to realize a new world. Now, of course, there are no guarantees of success. Whether an experiment is deemed successful is established only consequently by its fruits. And on this criterion, Bunge's experiments with mapping, which he began 60 years or so ago, have remained enormously fertile and productive. So his idea around moving away from Euclidean geometries of mapping and absolute space, treating the community studied as partners and participants in research rather than objects of research, being open-minded about what can be mapped and how it can be portrayed, and thinking of maps as critical political artifacts to make progressive social arguments about justice, fairness, and equality. All of these ideas continue to hold sway. So Bunge may now be a historical figure, but his work is not yet history. He is still part of the conversation, still enjoined within the pragmatist task facing us all every day of coping with the world and trying to make it better. Samuel Beckett, another closet pragmatist, put it, try, fail, try harder, fail better. Bunge failed better. Thank you.
Hello? Trevor, you finished your presentation, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't see the chair around for some reason. I don't know. Ugo, maybe he lost the connection. He said in the chat that he has some problem with the connections. Okay, never mind.
Okay.
In the role of chair. So thank you very much, Trevor, for this very interesting and illuminating presentation. It was very dense, but very, very interesting indeed. Now, we do have some time for, well, more than some time to be sure, because we have actually booked the Zoom room until 5 o'clock. So to have some questions and discussion on your presentation. Now, let me check first of all if we have something in the chat. Well, for the time being, just the message from Mugo about his problem with the connection, so that's not really relevant. We have a question from DNR, which is the equivalent of question and reply, which said, Trevor, did you ever attempt to get Bunge's FBS files via FOIA? I don't know whether you can also see that question. Maybe that you can start reply to this question, and then we can open the virtual floor to a live question. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good. Whatever is the norm for this occasion, but I'm very happy to entertain any questions, whether through the chat component or in person. So yes, I mean, clearly this goes to the FOI, Freedom of Information request. Bunge was convinced that he was hounded by the FBI and CIA. And I was telling Ugo just before I gave my presentation that the one time I spoke to Bunge on the phone, he died in 2013, he started his conversation by saying, they are listening, you know, be careful what you say. He was convinced that the CIA had tapped his phone in Quebec, and that everything that he was saying was being recorded. And indeed, there is a very large FBI file on Bunge. And apparently it's over 2,000 pages. I have got a fraction of that Freedom of Information request that has brought that material from the FBI out into the world, but it's only a small chunk. In order to make the Freedom of Information requests, you have to have the social insurance number of the person that you're asking for, and we have not been able to. I've not been able to find that. I'm actually just in the last year have started a project writing the biography of Bunge. It's being funded by Canada's Social Science Research and Humanities funding agency. And we just began this as COVID happened. And so everything was been effectively shut down. So I haven't made a lot of progress, but I know that we're going to have to get this social insurance number to be able to retrieve from the FBI its file on Bunge. Bunge, both his wives have died. He had 3 children, 2 of them are dead. There is one that we were communicating with, who we hope you would be able to get the social insurance number from. But she sort of just disappeared over the last year and a half. I should say I've been doing this project with a colleague at UBC. This is Luke Bergman. So yes, there is a file. I'd love to see it. The 10 pages or so that I have are fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of blacked out text. And it is, in fact, a recording of various conversations that Bunge had. He was a radical right from the get-go. He was involved in radical protest activism as a graduate student, both at Wisconsin and then later in Seattle. In fact, he talks about in one of his letters of buying a demonstration suit, as he called it, which he would wear whenever he did protests. So he was kind of a marked man. This in the 50s, after all. You know, this is the McCarthy era. This vehement, vitriolic anti-communism, and Bunge thought of himself as a communist. So in some sense, he asked for it to be put under surveillance, and he was put under surveillance, obviously, given the size of this file. So I'd love to see it, but I haven't yet seen it other than this short extract that someone was able to get. Okay.
Thanks, Trevor, and I'm here again. Sorry, I had a problem with my connection. Thanks for your fascinating talk. And today, as I told you before the seminar, I was going through the special the theme issue dedicated to Bill Bunge in Pragmatism Human Geography. And I was reading the piece by Andy Merrifield.
Right.
And, yeah, that was interesting to read that going through Fitzgerald prompted him a sense of nostalgia. He writes nostalgic because he writes then there was still hope, then there was still radical activism, geographical activism, scholarly engagement. And then he provocatively ends his commentary saying Fitzgerald is no geography classic. How it could be, considering the way the discipline has moved in the exact opposite direction to almost everything this book says. To that degree, anyone interested in a career in geography today, a career as a professional geographer with tenure, citations, grants, the whole bit, should pass up reading Fitzgerald. It's not a book for you. Should you read it? Should it touch you, inspire you, prompt you to take action? Beware and be warned. Big trouble lies ahead. I think it's really, of course, in the style of Andy Merrifield. It's very provocative, but I think this was written in about 10 years ago. He was writing, there was, at the time of Bunge, there was still hope, there was radical activism. But today, 2020, we see that there is a new sense of activism, especially in the Black community. We have Black Lives Matter. And so how do you think Bunge is useful to the understanding and also the practical intervention in this kind of scenario of today's renewed Black politics and liberation politics, and in what sense geographers can reread today Fitzgerald against this new background with so many opportunities for doing kind of militant research, activist research, and so on. And if you think today there is this kind of usage of also mapping in geographical activism. Thanks.
Right. Thank you for that question. I should say, maybe this is telling stories from out of school. Andy Merrifield, despite writing that, and having seemingly left academia, left geography, is now back in the fold. So he had certainly not distanced himself from the academy or even Bunge. So he's still part of the academic community, hasn't left it to become an activist. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're suggesting is exactly right. I mean, it seems to me, so I think I've hinted, been in geography for a long while, over 40 years now, as a professional geographer. I mean, it seems to me that the discipline has increasingly embraced activism. Certainly, when we have job candidates coming to UBC and other people giving seminars within human geography, there is invariably a activist component, if not dominating the narrative of the talk itself. In Canada, it's bound up especially, it's not so much Black Lives Matter, although certainly that has been a theme in some people's work, but it's been around First Nations peoples and the activism associated with them. And it has become, I mean, more the mainstream. This is how geography is done, it seems to me, for a large number of geographers, which I think is wonderful. But it seems to me that it comes in, that this is the importance of the Bungean legacy. I mean, he was really the first urban geographer in America to actually talk about the Black inner city and race and begin to engage in forms of activism. It simply wasn't done. In 1960s America, the Black inner city was sort of terra incognita. It was just not a place that anyone talked about or wrote about or even went there, let alone live there and to engage in activism. David Lay is someone that you and I talked about just before the talk began, had also begun to do that in his own dissertation, but he was not really engaged in activism in the same way that Bill Bunge was. So yeah, I think Bunge was such a precursor, and going to his creativity and his kind of larger vision of what was important. I don't think there was anyone in geography quite like him. I mean, there's David Harvey on the left as well. This is the beginnings of radical geography in the United States. But Bunge was not, but Harvey was not an activist. He was a theorist. I mean, a wonderful theorist, but he didn't engage in activism in the way that Bunge did. So that's, I think, why we should pay attention to Bunge. I think he continues, as I said in my conclusion, to have relevance. He's a historic figure, but he still has value for the present.
Thank you. I've also one more question. Yeah, it also came to my mind, came up to my mind, yeah, the parallel with David Harvey, because also David Harvey produced a a book that was in a way can be associated with theoretical geography, the explanation in geography, and then he became a radical when he moved to Baltimore. But my thought is about the fact of producing map through interactions with people. I recently bought the famous, but perhaps forgotten by many, world map by Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, dating back to the medieval age, dating back to 1154. It's one of the earliest examples of a world map. And it was very detailed. It represented the whole known world, including Europe, Asia, and Africa at that time. And he gained the information by speaking to travelers in groups or individually. So I think this was this is fascinating because at the very origin of at the very early stages of mapping in the modern time, at least, mapping was based on this social interaction, on this dialogue with people. At this time, with the travelers. And then this kind of radical geography mapping practice in a way resumed this way of in the 70s especially, this cognitive mapping, this behavioralist mapping, this perceptionist mapping, resumed this conception of mapping through engagement, through social engagement, to engagement with people, with real ordinary people. And I think it is fascinating because it reconnects this radical mapping stage to the very early stages of modern mapping. So modern equation is an observation and an inspiration that I was inspired by your talk in this direction. I have we have two questions. One from a colleague here, a geographer, Giulia Urso, and then another one from another colleague here, Margherita Grazioni. Please, Giulia, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Barnes, for your really interesting talk. It was fascinating and also very clear, so I don't have further question on that, but much more a curiosity. So according to you, when listening to these new metrics, let's say that Bunge found somehow to describe some phenomena, I was thinking about this situation we are living, so this pandemic and lockdowns and these new ways also of living or experimenting space. So according to you, what metric would Bunge deem as salient or relevant to the geography of the new inequalities that in some way this situation might produce?
I mean, very good question and very hard to answer. I mean, I think I would say the two things that I most appreciated from his work in Fitzgerald, which seems like they could be transported to the present. First, that he would ask the people themselves, I mean, what is important in their lives? So, I mean, this is again one of the innovations that he carried out in his work. So rather than treating the people in his community as simply research subjects, who you then extract as much information as you can. They become part of the research process itself. So it's community driven. It's their concerns that are important. So a much more participatory way of undertaking research. And the second thing that that strikes me as being innovative in Bunge's approach, at least in his mapping, is thinking through just the range of items that might be mapped. It's not just the kind of regular things like income or rents or even housing conditions. I mean, the idea of mapping dead bodies of children, or he has another map of rat bites through Fitzgerald. So opening your horizon to the possibilities out there of what can be cartographically represented, and taking your clue from the people that are being mapped. Off the top of my head, those are the two things I would say that might come from a Bungean approach to cartography. So being open-minded, and I mean, clearly recognizing the importance of the social. I mean, maybe that doesn't need to be said, but I mean, all of these maps were deeply embedded within social relationships, and power, of course, is coursing through those relationships, and you have to be aware of that. These are not simply scientific artifacts, these maps. They are products of a inherently deep set of social processes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Trevor, for your answer. And I think Margherita wants to make a question.
Yes, thank you. Just to say that there is a question that was posted previously in the Q&A in the chat. I've just pasted in the chat, so just in case you want to have a look at that and reply to that later. So thanks, Professor Barnes, for your presentation. It was extremely fascinating, and I mean, I always find myself feeling like a rookie when it comes down to mapping and cartography. So that was very compelling for me. And I would dwell on the reply you gave to Ugo, actually, and also on Sarah's comment here in the chat again, if I may, because I believe that this intersection between let's say, an heterodox use of mapping and cartography, activism, and all these implications, it's really interesting, because I was thinking about the fact that actually there is something very important about making a different use of mapping. I'm also thinking about a webinar we had recently where some colleagues from the University of Rome have shown us how they are using maps to portray inequality inside Rome, and they have been working a lot also on COVID, like intersecting different indicators to show how COVID spreads much in some neighborhoods based on also poverty indicators and stuff. On the other hand, you also said that Bunge actually was not an activist, and I wanted like to develop on this point and hear from your perspective, because I believe that, again, as I said, mapping is an extremely powerful tool, but at the same time, it might be the case where actually it remains, let's say, a technical feature in a way, or a specialist feature mastered by those who can use some specific tools like GIS and stuff, and by scholars. And when it's used in a community context, it may be the case that actually those scholars or let's say, or people that can use these tools may end overpowering the members of the community they want to build a representation with. And so this can impair, let's say, the political potential of mapping as a tool of representation, and also as a tool of prefiguration in a way, because you said that Bunge also made this use of this very, let's say, bleak use of cartography to portray how the world could be after a nuclear blast. Actually, that could be also made for, let's say, more positive or hopeful prefiguration. But still, I wanted to, I mean, I know it's not a proper question, it's probably more than a reflection, but I wanted to hear more about this issue of mapping as an inclusive or either an exclusionary tool, because I have the feeling that it goes the same thing with all those participatory planning, let's say, projects and stuff that may have very good intentions and very good faith, but at the end of the day tend to exclude the community they are supposed to be empowering. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that great question. This is slightly tangential. I'm sorry, I can't do two things at the same time. I'm antediluvian when it comes to this technology, and I can't handle the chat room and talk and at the same time. I know my colleagues, some of my younger colleagues, are marvelous at that, but I'm afraid I'm not. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really relevant, important question. I mean, mapping can always go two ways, it seems to me, which is why I had that slide about the American use of some of Bunge's ideas, in a way, the American military use of some of Bunge's ideas in the presentation. You're always on a knife edge, because mapping, as we know, can be used for surveillance, for control, for repression, for disciplining, just as much as it can be used for creating the social good. And so, and clearly it's become enormously corporatized. And it's all about money and profit. And it's also become militarized. I mean, it was always part of the military arsenal of weapons. So I think you always have to be skeptical around mapping as a technique, but it clearly also can be used for good, or for, let me define that more, I mean, for progressive social ends, which I think is what Bunge shows you, and shows you how you might be able to do that. As I said to Julia in the last question, that you have to get people involved. You have to not as simply research subjects, but as people who help shape the very nature of the map that you produce. I mean, even then, I mean, Bunge was criticized. Here he is, a white man coming into this black inner city neighborhood and organizing, or at least co-organizing. And it seemed to some, not many, it's almost a kind of a colonial move. Why do they require him to do this? So there are always these kinds of questions, and we always have to be, it seems to be, alert and open to them. I don't have any foolproof answers. I would go back to the pragmatist first principles, that we need to just continue to talk about these issues and to hash through them in a conversation. Not that we're ever going to find any kind of final resolution, but the talking, I think, is part and parcel of very much part and parcel of the process. Do you have suggestions as to how this knife edge can be negotiated between kind of authoritarianism, use of maps, and a community version of maps? You got your mute on.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying thanks a lot for contributing to this conversation. I wasn't expecting, let's say, a definitive answer, but thanks a lot. It's really interesting to debate these kind of things, especially nowadays. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, I think there is Laszlo Checker who is wants to make a question. Please, Laszlo.
Okay. All right. Hello, Trevor. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And I have one question that you have briefly talked about this at the end of your presentation, but could you tell us more about how some elements of Bunge's approach, especially in Fitzgerald neighborhood, could still be considered innovative for human geographers in 2021? And I'm especially curious about your response and your opinion, because his work and his interactions with the local community was criticized, especially by his colleague Gwendolyn Warren.
Right. Yeah. It's obviously it's a delicate issue, but I think this is going to sound very tentative, but I think I want to defend him in what he did during the 1960s. Even though, as you rightly say, that sort of a larger context here, just to let people know. Eric Shepard and I did an edited book on effectively the recent history of radical geography in North America. And we had a number of essays that were all place-based. And one of the essays was about, in effect, Fitzgerald and Bunge. And it was co-written with Gwendolyn Warren, Cindy Katz, and Nick Hyman were also authors. And in that essay, they give you, in some ways, the two versions of Bunge, and the good version of Bunge, which I think I have provided here, and then the bad version of Bunge. As I said in my talk, he was obviously a very troubled man and lived a troubled life. And Gwendolyn Warren in particular, who was his co-founder of the DGEI, in this essay, writes about the way in which he was troubled. She says he was a racist, that he was a misogynist. She says that he sexually harassed her. I mean, there's no evidence as such in the essay. I mean, other than what she says. And obviously, I think we have to take what she says very seriously. But I mean, but I think there is a but, that he did engage in this innovative, I think iconoclastic work at the time. He did try to involve the community. One aspect of his research that was part of the DGEI that I never talked about was setting up university classes for Fitzgerald residents. They were partly offered by the University of Michigan, partly through Michigan State and Wayne State University. They didn't last very long, but in effect they gave free classes, free tuition to any member of the Fitzgerald community. And Bunge wanted them, well, I mean, there was a range of classes that were offered, including mapping and sort of urban geography, urban theory. And so he thought that this would be important, again, for community members to be able to have those kinds of technical skills and a vocabulary to talk about their neighborhood in order to present the community from their terms. Now, again, I realize that again, it's this white man, Bill Bunge, who is setting this up. This is not coming from within the community as well as such, in the sense that they are not lobbying the university for these courses. Bunge is making this happen. So there's always, I mean, the kind of a sense of a colonial figure behind this. So it's messy, it's difficult. I'm really not sure in my own mind quite what I think of Bunge. He's such a sort of torn figure, both doing good but also doing bad. I do think we can learn, as I've said into other questions, from the good things, in my mind at least, the progressive political things that he undertook in Fitzgerald around involving the community, engaging with maps, thinking of maps as offering a range of possibilities. These, I think, are important to recognize and have continuing relevance. I know I sort of feel I'm rambling around this question, Laszlo, but it's just, it's such a difficult, I find it a difficult mix to untangle the personal, the political, as well as the social. It's such a kind of a morass there, and given Bunge's character, I mean, it would be wonderful if he was, if it was just clear that he was doing things for the right reasons, and I'm not sure that he was. What do you think, Laszlo? Having taken my class, now listen to me. Think there are any straightforward answers?
Hi, Trevor. Thank you very much for your answer. And I think like the difficulties that you mentioned was already helpful, because not just with Bunge, but in other cases, I have the same feeling that it's very difficult to say that one approach or one scholar was all good, and especially Bunge is not here now to respond to these criticisms.
Right.
But we talked about this during class, that he couldn't actually respond to this criticism comments coming from Gwendolyn Warren.
Right.
I think if I can say something more, I was thinking about comparing Bunge's model of geographical expedition in deprived neighborhoods with this new thing that was introduced in the tourism industry since the 2000s. This slum tourism, this poverty tourism. The fact that the tourism industry in a way has appropriated this kind of practice, and also a kind of professional way of doing research. It also implies a professional way of doing ethnography, kind of detachment from the field. You can be there, but you cannot be really within the field. So I think the legacy of Bunge is very relevant today, because it indicates that in order to do a kind of a socially embedded, socially rooted ethnography, you have to be there. You have to live there, because it was based in Fitzgerald. He lived there for a long time. And even if you are not a local resident, you have to settle in a place if you want to really engage with local community, in order to avoid any kind of live like a local experience that could be transferred to the researcher's experience. So you have to be there, and I think for PhD researchers, this is a very important message that they can take home from Bill Bunge's work. The fact that qualitative, field-based research needs a lot of grounding within the field, especially when it comes to deal with low-income neighborhoods and racialized groups like Black people. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. That was very well expressed, and I agree entirely with what you said. It is a form of ethnography, of being there, that enabled him to do this qualitative research. There's a kind of an irony here, that it seems to me that American geography becomes, or tries to become, professionalized through its embrace of formalism, of quantitative methods, of abstract theory, of becoming a proper social science, which is what Bunge was part of in Seattle. That group of graduate students were in effect trying to make geography, American geography, a proper social science, to professionalize the discipline. And I think Bunge realized through living in Detroit, living in Fitzgerald, that wasn't going to work, at least for him, and that the kind of the geometrical, theoretical, the way of viewing subjects as simply informants wasn't going to help him with his project, which was deeply political and social, and sometimes went against the grain of the professionalization of the discipline. And of course, in the end, he couldn't stay in the discipline. He couldn't become and remain attached to it, and had to leave. So yeah, I think it's very much bound up with these issues around professionalization and moving to a new kind of way of doing things that was not part of that canon. So as I said, I agree entirely with what you said, Ugo. Thought you were very well, very nicely framed and phrased it.
Thank you, Trevor. I think we are done, and we can end our conversation here. If there is no more question, I think you gave a great talk on this figure, and we have been honored to have you here. And the student, the PhD students at JSSI at our institute will be familiar with your writing next month, when I will give the second year economic geography course, which is based on your fantastic textbook co-authored with Brett Christopher's Economic Geography, A Critical Introduction, that you published in 2017 or 18. So it's, I think it's a great introduction to the field of critical economic geography. So thanks again, Trevor, and I hope we will have other opportunities to have you here, perhaps in person in the next future, when all this pandemic will be gone. And so thank you, and thanks everyone for having attended this event. And thanks, and have a great day whenever you are at this moment. Thanks.
Well, yes, thank you, and thank you everyone for your wonderful, insightful questions. I really appreciated them, and it really was an honor and a privilege to give a talk here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Professor Barros. Bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.